Justin Milano and I met in Bhutan in 2015 on a twin expedition to Bhutan, my first trip there, and he was just getting this notion, which became abroad.io, started, and I'll let them explain it to you. So Justin, Manuela, and Sydney, please join us here on stage.
All right, hello everybody. So my name is Justin Milano and I'm the founder of Abroad.io. And before we start today, I want to offer an appreciation to the World Innovation Network. We're in our 6th year of operation here at Abroad, and I can confidently say we would not be where we are today without the support of Rob and so many of you in this audience who have been such great champions of what we've been up to. So thank you everybody for all that you've done for us. So I have the great pleasure today of introducing two experts, two extraordinary human beings. So we have Dr. Sydney Savion here and also Manuela Mischke-Reeds. And Sydney, so I'm going to start with you. Now we're talking about personal and organizational resilience. And you've led learning at organizations like Dell and Air New Zealand and now CityBlock Health. What do organizations need to learn around how to navigate change and build resilience in today's increasingly complex and chaotic world?
That's loaded. Let me start with this. The famed neurologist, psychologist, and Holocaust survivor, Viktor Frankl once said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is the power for us to choose our response. And in that response lies our growth and our
freedom.
Our freedom. That's right. And I believe that, this is, I don't know, since COVID, the energy has been quite frenetic and episodic. And I think change and resilience are forms of energy. And although energy cannot be observed directly, it can be experienced. And in my experience, I do not believe in the traditional approaches to change management and building organizational resilience. Why? Because 70% of change management initiatives fail. And recent research has shown that not much has changed since it was first reported in 1993. And the second thing is there's so much research on resilience, and yet we still haven't broken the code. And I would point to one of Einstein's many moments of discernment in terms of we can't expect to solve a problem from the same level of thinking that it was created. But what I do believe is we have a very practical opportunity to look to the wisdom and learn from mental health, discipline. And there's 3 things, and I wrote these things down because I don't want you to miss this, that I think, or 3 areas I think that we should focus on in the form of a question. How do people change and release from their attachments and resistance? How do we build self-awareness, understand our fears, and help people transcend those attachments? And third, how do we create the psychological safety, esteem, and belonging to help people self-actualize? Now, our collaboration with Abroad, I think we have a very real opportunity to do just that. You know, with the innovative and sustainable approaches of Abroad, I think we have an opportunity to develop our people's mental and emotional health. And I am counting on that this experience with Abroad will help also impact our patient experience at CityBlock.
Oh, wonderful.
How did I do?
Well,
great.
well, so speaking of the mental health discipline, Manuela, you've been a psychologist now for over 25 years, and not just a psychologist, a somatic psychologist who specializes in trauma. So one of the things we'd love to learn from you is when we talk about helping people transcend their attachments, and also just looking at organizations nowadays, mental health is at the top of everybody's priority list. You know, why is that? And especially, why is this thing trauma important?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. I really love that Rob started with having you stand up and take a breath. Yeah. because that's really the nugget right there. We can't process what's happening. It's too fast. And so one definition of trauma is actually that it's too fast, too soon, too much, overwhelms us. And we live in times right now where information is coming at us and just in a rapid speed, and we can't digest it. And trauma is not just individual. Trauma is also systemic, which we just heard about, right? It's collective trauma. It's community trauma. It impacts our families, our communities, on organizations. And so we really need to think about developing a strategy for organizations that include well-being and mental health, not just an app, which are helpful, but really an integrated approach. I'd like to borrow from a Buddhist parable called the second arrow. And the Buddha asked his student, he said, if you be hit by an arrow, would that be painful? And the student said, yeah, it'd be very painful. And then he said, if you be hit by a second arrow, would that be even more painful? And the student said, yeah, it would be very painful. And the Buddha said, well, you can't really do anything about the first arrow, but the second arrow is really your response to the first arrow, and you have a choice about that. Trauma is a fact of life. It just happens. We have trauma. It's part of our human condition. But we can train in resilience, we can train in compassion, and we can create choices to help trauma and to heal trauma. That's very, very possible. So we have to become trauma informed. It has to be infused into organizations, not just as one quick fix-it approach, but really as a strategy.
Yeah, and so Manuela, there's a lot of talk about trauma nowadays in the world, and I'm not sure that all of us really understand what actually trauma is. So can you help define it on the simplest of levels so all of us can understand what we're navigating?
I really appreciate that question because we all assume that we know what trauma is. We think that trauma is in the event, and it's very compelling, right? A war, car accident, you name it. It's actually in our nervous system. It's in our bodies. It's right here. And it's mammalian responses that we have when we experience trauma, and we keep forgetting that, and we keep on going. So I want to just borrow a little concept here, if you indulge me, the stress-trauma continuum. We have, on one side, we have stress, then we have a tipping point, and then we have trauma leading to post-traumatic stress disorder. Stress, actually, over here can be positive stress, and positive stress encourages us to be motivated, creative, playful. It's wonderful. A lot of innovation comes from positive stress. But if you go to 4 weddings in a row, you're going to have some traumatic responses to it, right? So even if you have a lot of good stress, if you don't have adequate time to digest, or my favorite word, metabolize the experience, take a break, take a breath, really understand what's happening, then you're going to build up towards chronic stress, and then the tipping point is reached. And then when you have overwhelming events, like a war, like a pandemic, right, we're going to have experiences that are going to overwhelm our coping mechanism, and we start breaking down. And then it leads to diagnosis and grave consequences, really. We're actually equipped, biologically speaking, from a nervous system point, we're actually equipped to deal with stress and trauma. We just need to learn how to metabolize it and have enough adequate time to rest and digest. That's the system that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, that's so interesting, Manuela. So in today's world, what we often see in organizations is that because of, technology is a beautiful thing, right? But so many of us, we wake up in the morning and we're activated from the time that we wake up to the time that we go to sleep. And so there isn't that ability for rest and digest.
Right.
So in the stress-trauma continuum, you're talking about how we're actually moving ourselves more and more towards this state of trauma, and then when these events happen, we're less able to then respond to them.
Yeah, we could even say those are like microtraumas, right? And we're constantly in this state of activation, and we're not even tuned in enough that we are activated, right? We don't really metabolize it, and that's where somatic knowledge comes in, really tuning into our present moment experience, which is really, really important.
Yeah, excellent. So as we navigate these things, I hear you talking about collective trauma, and we talked about this at organizational level. So Sydney, before you talked about building this personal, this mental and emotional resilience, navigating attachments, and so forth. How at CityBlock and other organizations have you seen mental health and trauma and these type of things and resilience be addressed at the systemic cultural level? So not just the responsibility of the individual, but also the responsibility of the organization to create the conditions that can be supportive here.
Yeah, well, let's talk about CityBlock. It's a high growth company. And pretty much with any high growth company, we're virtually a new company every 6 months. But like with any other company, we still have the pressures to achieve hyper growth, profitability, and returns for our VCs. You know about this. But we're on a mission to radically change health and mental and social care for marginalized communities so that we can all live happier lives. And one of the things with any change, if you will, Justin, is that that energy, if you will, can be felt, across the organization. So any one ripple effect can be felt across the organization. And one of the things that I was thinking is, with culture at the epicenter of all of this, I think we can use energy to either harness and help people adapt to change, or it could erode change. And I think we're all bound by the energy that we project in this world. And one of the things that being trained in systems thinking is that that's how the parts are interrelate with the whole. And one of the things that we're doing at CityBlock, I would say, is stepping back and thinking about how this interconnectedness can generate benefits. And one of the crown jewels of these benefits, I think, is value optimization. And so the way we're trying to realize it at CityBlock is creating a holistic strategy to focus on that space between stimulus and response. And we're going to focus on 3 things. We are focusing on 3 things. Now, it's a journey. We're focusing on culture, people, and learning. As it relates to culture, we're trying to figure out ways to nurture the ecosystem to ensure people feel psychologically safe so that they can learn, grow, and thrive. As it relates to people, is providing resources like our collaboration with Abroad to help people really change the narrative about self-compassion, about forgiveness, about fear. And lastly, in terms of learning, we're helping develop mindsets and behavior so that people can pivot in times of uncertainty. And then I think the net of it for me is that the real voyage of learning consists not in seeking new knowledge, but in seeing with new eyes. What do you think about that?
That's really, wow. The real voyage of learning is not about seeking new knowledge, but by seeing with new eyes. Okay, interestingly. So on that note of seeing with new eyes, this may seem like a little bit of a far out question, Manuela. What can we learn from indigenous cultures about how to navigate some of the change that we're experiencing here as human beings?
I think that's beautiful, because it's really not about going out there and seeking new knowledge, right? It's really appreciating what we already have. We actually know what heals. We know what heals trauma even. It's complex and it's interconnected of what we need to do there. But indigenous knowledge or indigenous wisdom really is timeless wisdom. And it teaches us the relationship between ourselves, others, communities, and the earth, the environment. And in our culture, we focus a lot, even in therapy, right? You're all very familiar with, I'm sure. You focus on your self-actualization, the me part. But we often don't focus me in service of, right? In service of my family, in service of my community, in service of the planet. And even therapists make that mistake, right? We close the door and we have the clients behind closed door. We focus on their individual trauma. But no trauma exists in a vacuum. It's interrelated. Trauma affects families, communities, as I said. So we really need to think about systemically. And what we can learn from indigenous culture, not to romanticize, because there's plenty of trauma and collective trauma in indigenous cultures that we're just now beginning to reconcile with, right? But the wisdom is there, and the wisdom is pretty simple. Pay attention, attune to yourself in relation to others and to the environment, to the planet. Live in harmony, live in balance, listen, attune and listen. And so we're really talking about a kind of an embodied compassion, not just thinking about it, but actually embodying it. And we can think about our indigenous really means the place that you come from before it was colonized, the original inhabitants. We can think of our work culture as being colonized. We push hard, we go for productivity, results driven, very speedy, yeah, we move very fast. And that pushes people's bodies, minds, hearts, and psyche to the brink. And we know this, right? We have seen this with the pandemic. The collective trauma of pandemic has been really up on the forefront for us now. And so that pushing forward is really breaking us down, breaking down our mental health. So what we can learn from this timeless wisdom of indigenous cultures is really to come back into harmony and into living in balance with ourselves in relation to others. And if we do that on an organizational level, we really are beginning to create a trauma-infused lens that we bring to every aspect, like what you're describing, all the aspects to organizations. And then we can all reach our human potential.
Wow, thanks so much for that, Manuela. So interestingly, this conference is called Transcend. And Abraham Maslow, a lot of us are familiar with the work around self-actualization, about each of us realizing or recognizing our potential. What a lot of us don't know is actually when Maslow was passing, he actually revised his model and he added another layer above self-actualization called SelfTranscendence.
On his deathbed.
Yeah, exactly, which was basically understanding our interconnectedness with everything, that we're part of the natural world, we're part of the cosmos, and we're here to serve something far greater than us, that it goes way beyond each of us realizing our own potential. Right. So that brings us some fascinating explorations.
Yeah, and actually Alfred Adler, a German physician and therapist, coined a term called Gemeinschaftsgefühl, which Gemeinschaft means community, and Gefühl of this feeling. So it's the feeling that you have for a community. It's your empathy, or better yet, compassion. Compassion is really empathy in action. So we take action on behalf of our community we serve. And so when we have a Gemeinschaftsgefühl, we have a sense of belonging, because that's really what trauma disrupts, is your sense of belonging and safety. And that's what's so detrimental. And I want to be also very clear that it's not about organizations needing to solve people's personal trauma. It's really about beginning to become aware and understand trauma in a more holistic way, so that we can
Be informed.
Be informed and have a new awareness.
All right, wonderful. So we've talked about a lot of things up here, so I'm just going to do a quick summary. I know we're also tight on time here a bit. So 70% of change management initiatives fail. You can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it. To build resilience, help your people build the mental and emotional resilience to transcend their attachments and better respond to change. Trauma is not in the event, it's in the nervous system. It's not about healing the trauma of the individual, the organization, but about helping people become trauma-informed. Indigenous cultures teach us about the interconnectedness of all things. So all of this leads us to an inquiry and a question, which is, what is the quest of the modern organization? Is it to help each person in the organization achieve their highest level of performance and drive as much possible performance as you can out of them? Or is it to recognize that each person is part of this delicate interconnected web, and from that new mindset, that new point of view, perhaps we can transcend our potential and achieve a greater purpose? Something for us to consider. Thank you.